Hey, welcome to Bad Takes. This show is where we unpack some of the best of the worst takes out there on the internet. I'm here with my co-host, Matthew Iglesias. I'm Laura McGann, the executive editor of Grid. And this week, Matt, you've got a take for us, right?
I do. This is a take that has come to us from the Climate Justice Alliance, which is, a nonprofit group, a political advocacy organization. And they are talking about the Inflation Reduction Act that happened earlier in August. And they say, after careful study of the language of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, Climate Justice Alliance concludes that the harms of the bill as it is currently written outweigh its benefits. Climate Justice Alliance is opposing the reconciliation bill in its current form, and so on and so forth. I mean, they are saying not just that, they don't love this bill, but that it's actually worse than doing nothing from a climate justice perspective.
Wow. I mean, that is a bold, that is a rough reaction, I'd say. Just for those of you out there who might not recall that a bill called IRA is actually a climate bill, what we're talking about is this huge bill that spends something like, what's the whole number, 700 billion or 600 billion?
300, it's like 370 billion in direct spending, plus about the same amount in loan guarantees. So could be 300 billion, could be 700 billion, depending on how you look at it.
Depending on how you look at it. But just in total, we're looking at probably one of the biggest climate bills to pass in Congress in, I don't know.
Ever.
I think ever. Yeah, we can say it. We can say this is the biggest climate bill to pass in Congress ever. So it is, to me, pretty surprising that a, fairly large in the mix climate group have such a churlish response to it. I know I'm sort of chuckling a little bit. I mean, but that's just my first glance at it, right? And maybe I'm not seeing the bigger picture here. I don't know. I think maybe the key question here is, what is social justice and climate change about? That this is not just any climate group, but one that is focused on the idea of justice and climate.
So climate justice is a sort of an interesting term of art. And I have a kind of a churlish take on what the climate justice movement is.
Everything is churlish today.
But I'm going to put a pin in my mean take on climate justice.
Let's try to just explain, right? Let's just lay out what it is in sort of neutral terms.
So here's the idea, right? The environmental movement in its kind of current form, right? It grows in the 1970s out of earlier conservation, so you have the climate movement today, the environmental movement of the 70s, the sort of conservation movement of the 1880s and 1890s. And this is a movement that is primarily made up of sort of affluent, white, professional class people who care a lot about nature and, read these books and things like that. And poorer people of color, et cetera, are like not that interested in or invested in environmentalism.
And perhaps, I'll let you finish. But I think it's also the question of, how much were other people not involved in the movement considered.
Right. So in environmental justice, which then evolves into climate justice, is the idea of, look, we need to incorporate the perspectives of lower income people, non-white people, into our thinking about climate and environmentalism. And, some really important insights, I think, actually come out of this, right? Which is, one thing that I've written about a lot over the years is like the impact of particulate air pollution on kids, right? So if you are living near a highway, you tend to be poorer because there's just sort of noise, associated with highways that's a disamenity. But that means that you are exposed to a very disproportionate amount of like car exhaust.
Sure.
And that's it's a social justice concern. It's an equality concern. And importantly, it's not something that, say, a stereotypical quote unquote nature lover would necessarily care about, right? It's an environmental justice perspective. You're not saying we need to preserve the pristine woodlands. You're saying we need to preserve the health of poor children, right?
Correct.
So that's environmental justice sort of at its core. Then you move into climate justice, and it's, we're trying to take that same attitude toward the issue of climate change. We're trying to center the kind of views and opinions and interests of economically or socioeconomically sort of marginalized groups, like at an appropriately high level of abstraction. Like that's really appropriate and important. But then it loops you back to the question of, okay, so like we're talking about climate change. We're talking about legislation that is going to reduce carbon dioxide emissions considerably. It is financed by taxes on the wealthy and international corporations. It should create some jobs in clean energy industries. And it's like why would you oppose it?
Right.
And I mean, I can tell you why they oppose it.
I would say, to me, the thing that jumped out at me reading through the different pieces of the legislation is, you have covered over the years just the devastating effects of growing up in a neighborhood that has more of these particles in the air. I mean, it is measurable and it's real. And the bill, according to analysts who've looked at it, seems to predict that within a decade, pollution will be reduced, roughly speaking, on a relative scale. We're looking at a 40% reduction in air pollution. And that's going to make a big difference for kids in areas that suffer from this environment. And so that was something that to me really jumped out at first. And I was looking through this before I was aware of reactions from any group, right? I just wasn't following yet the response from different climate groups. So I'm thinking if the position is that this bill does more harm than good, it's going to have to do a lot of harm to outweigh a 40% reduction in pollution. In my mind, even setting aside other parts of the bill, just that goal and that accomplishment alone is such a huge victory. That's, I think, what we should talk through now is sort of what, to get this deal done, a compromise had to be made. And so I think I want to still fairly look through what those are. I had trouble sort of seeing the details exactly of what some of these groups were pointing to.
So I think there's sort of like a 3 levels of objection that they have. So if you look at Zach Coleman did a good piece in Politico about climate justice groups' objections. Well, it's a comprehensive piece. It's
comprehensive. Yes, he lays out. I mean, the takes are coming fast and hot in this piece. Right. We recommend you take a look at it. We'll link to it.
So he talks about 2 things that are in the bill that they're really opposed to. One is there's a provision in the bill that says Biden has to go through with offshore oil and gas drilling in the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay.
So this had been a thing that, the federal government's been back and forth on offshore drilling in different places for years. And so obviously environmentalists don't like offshore oil and gas drilling. Joe Manchin apparently does like offshore oil and gas drilling. And so these leases will be written. You could totally see why, you wouldn't expect environmentalists to love that idea.
Sure.
What's odd here, I think, is the take that, that is so bad that it's worth opposing a bill that has this huge sort of aggregate reduction. The second thing is that there is a, as yet TBD, side agreement between Manchin, Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and possibly others to have some kind of reform of the permitting system.
So this is where it gets hazy for me because the details are not fully apparent yet. I think it's worth laying out what we know, though.
Nobody is sure what will be in this deal, in part because it just hasn't been decided. But one thing that I think almost certainly will be in the deal, because it relates very specifically to Joe Manchin, is he would like to build a pipeline that will take natural gas from West Virginia into the northeastern United States. And once the natural gas is in the Northeast, it could either be used to provide home heat in New England, where right now they burn a lot of fuel oil, or else it could be exported to Europe, where they used to import all this gas from Russia. But as you've probably heard, there's a war.
Yes. I also we received some listener feedback that you and I are deeply steeped in Joe Manchin and who he is. But just to pause and say, Joe Manchin is a senator from West Virginia, and he was not on board with a previous bill, and he was critical in getting this bill passed through the Senate. And so that's why, this moderate to conservative Democrat who cares a lot about energy issues, coal, gas, etc. He's from West Virginia. He needs to be on board. So this is why this is going on.
And I think one way
needs to be won over.
And I think one way to think about that is, after when Democrats got a majority in the Senate, there was a lot of kind of like jokes on Twitter about all the pork barrel spending that was going to flow to West Virginia.
Right.
Because Manchin was the sort of decisive guy. Manchin doesn't want that, right? Like if what he wanted was to vote for progressive ideas, but demand like a $50 trillion like golden statue to himself,
sure, right?
Like he could secure that. But he does not believe that dramatically increasing the amount of pork barrel spending in West Virginia will be helpful to West Virginia's long-term economic development. What he believes will be helpful to West Virginia's long-term economic development is constructing a pipeline so that they can export natural gas from West Virginia to the northeastern United States. But I think if you're like a liberal, a progressive person at home being like, why do we have to do this? Like, that's the right way to think about it. Like, this is Manchin's pork for West Virginia. This is the thing that he wants. This is the thing that he believes creates sustainable economic growth for his constituents. Because West Virginia is sitting on a lot of natural gas. New England is burning fuel oil to heat people's homes in the winter, which is not only expensive, but it's actually dirtier than burning gas. Anyway, climate justice groups do not like this idea. I mean, all environmentalists.
No environmentalists think this is a good idea on the merits, right? If we're looking at it, well, actually, the point being, you would look at this and go, if you're putting it in the column of advancing the cause of climate reform, probably not. But it's not just in that context. This is in the context of cutting a deal to get the bill passed.
Well, and again, if you just take those two things, right? I think most environmental groups have looked at those two provisions and they'll say, we don't favor this.
Right.
But the bill in the aggregate reduces emissions by a very large amount.
Right.
So we support the bill in the aggregate.
Right. But the other thing I would say about this is the reason this take stood out to me is it always happens that, you see it in lots of bills where groups will say, we are thrilled that this bill was passed. However, we don't like this piece and we wish this other thing and we have more to do, more work to do, and we blah, 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 blah. It is very rare that you get that full bore rejection. So that is where I thought this was unusual. But let's go through the third.
Well, so there's a third thing that I think was not covered that clearly in the Politico piece. But if you look at some other smaller scale controversies that have happened in the Biden administration, in the Biden years, actually going all the way back. When you and I were working together at Vox, one of the first articles I wrote about the Joe Biden campaign was about the allegation that he had plagiarized elements of his climate plan from the website of a group called the Blue-Green Alliance. The plagiarism aspect of that was like, who cares? The reality, which was true, is that Biden's approach to climate is very closely modeled after the approach of the Blue-Green Alliance, which is a labor union sort of, it's like a labor environmental mashup. Labor unions were very interested in making sure that any approach to climate change includes nuclear power, that it includes financial support for what's called carbon capture and sequestration, which is where you basically try to like get the CO2 and a smokestack, that it includes support for what's called direct air capture, which is sort of like artificial trees that would like suck CO2 out of the air. And last, labor unions want to say that a project that reduces emissions, right? So right now, a lot of coal is burned in metallurgy, right? So to make steel. So another way that you can make steel is by using hydrogen in place of coal to make the heat. But then you need to get hydrogen, which requires energy. So you can get hydrogen from burning natural gas. So if you have a plant that burns natural gas to manufacture hydrogen and then burns hydrogen to make steel, that is the cleanest steel in the world, right? And I heard a story from inside the Biden White House where somebody was suggesting—
I like inside stuff.
Yeah, this is inside. So somebody said that Biden should go to this Ohio steel facility where union labor is making steel with hydrogen, and it's the lowest carbon steel in the world. And somebody else in the White House vetoed the suggestion of a presidential visit there because climate justice groups would hate that idea, right? And, a lot of things go into, what does and doesn't make presidential trips. But that tension where the sort of labor side of the progressive movement wants this all of the above approach to decarbonization, while the climate justice wing is very narrowed in on conservation and renewables. I think that is fundamentally why the Climate Justice Alliance is willing to say, we blow this up. Because if you just look at the permitting and the oil and gas, you're going to land like where Sierra Club landed, or where NRDC landed, which is, we don't like those provisions, but in the aggregate, it reduces emissions. If you think that a lot of the emissions reductions are coming from things that are bad, like blue hydrogen, like nuclear, like CCS, that's when the bill starts to look like actually bad, right? This is not a wind and solar bill.
Right.
It's a tax credits for reducing carbon dioxide emissions bill, which could take the form of like wind and solar and batteries. But it is much, much, much more inclusive of that. And I think that's like the core objection here, but it doesn't seem warranted to me.
So what I found in aggregate was 24-1, that if you take what Manchin is getting versus the rest of the bill, that it's a huge margin. So it's not really close. To me, that means is just we're looking at something really deeply ingrained here, that this is really the definition of the line in the sand between these two factions on the left, that is the depth of this disagreement. Where I think that this is going awry is when you start to misrepresent the facts, right? That this is not these groups saying we are ideologically opposed to this, even if there is, even on net, that there's more reductions.
Yeah.
And so that's where, one, I think things get muddled because it's just not a good look to misrepresent facts. And so then your position just doesn't, look as credible.
Well, and the question in my mind, right, is like, we started with, okay, environmental justice, climate justice is supposed to be about centering the perspectives of the poor and of racial minority groups. And you land on, well, okay, this is coming from a position of kind of like renewables only fundamentalism. Right. And so the conceit underlying the whole thing is the idea that, low-income communities, African-American, Latino communities are like uniquely hostile to the continued existence of fossil fuel extraction. And somebody says this in the Politico story, right? They're talking about the oil and gas extraction. And the story says, that measure rankled racially and economically disadvantaged communities that lie in the shadow of the Gulf Coast petrochemical facilities, said Robert Bullard, director of the Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at Texas Southern University, and a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So that's telling. I mean, Bullard is an important figure in the history of environmental justice. That's why he's got this position on this advisory council. And so he is saying that we have essentially sold out, right? Working class African Americans in New Orleans, working class Latino people in South Texas in order to get this climate bill done, right? It's like
I believe in the Politico article, somebody used the term
we've been sold out.
We've been sold out. Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, that's a strong allegation. Such things have been known to happen.
They happen
in human history.
Yeah.
And the question is, like, is that true? Right? And what I think is fascinating is that there is a level on which I do think it's true, which is that if you look at surveys, right, of Democrats, leaving out Republicans, and you say, well, how do upscale Democrats differ from poorer Democrats? The biggest way that they differ is that affluent Democrats think climate change is a really, really, really high priority issue, whereas poor Democrats are more interested in topics like alleviating poverty, healthcare, education, and recently in addressing inflation and the cost of living. So I think it's true that, like, for Democrats to make a climate bill their centerpiece legislation reflects rich white Democrats sort of elbowing out the concerns of poorer Black and Hispanic Democrats, but not in the specific way that the climate justice groups are saying. Right? It's like doing a climate bill at all reflects a sort of elite perspective. If you listen to poor Democrats and they were like, what do you want to spend $370 billion on?
Sure.
They would say on Title I school funding,
right.
or
yes, on
on helping poor people. It's not like brain surgery.
It's not brain surgery here, that people are going to say, these are things that would help me in my life and my family and my community directly.
But within the context of a climate bill, I don't see any reason to believe that it goes this way, right? That we know that poorer Democrats are more worried about inflation than rich Democrats are. We know that the elected officials, Cedric Richmond had a sort of top White House advisory job, and before that, he was a House member from New Orleans. And when he was first appointed to that job, he was very heavily criticized by environmental groups because he's been so supportive of oil and gas extraction in the Gulf of Mexico.
Well, yeah.
And his successor, another African-American man representing an overwhelmingly Black district in New Orleans, he's also been criticized by left-wing groups for being too supportive of oil and gas extraction. The House Democrats who represent the low-income Latino South Texas districts, they've been criticized for being too supportive of oil and gas extraction. When Beto O'Rourke first, emerged on the national stage, one of the big hits on him from the left was that he was too supportive of oil and gas extraction. He's not Hispanic himself, but most of his constituents in El Paso were. Because, again, the people who live where the oil wells are quite worried about the economic impact.
Yes, this is a driver of the local economy. The people in Alaska are not the ones pushing to cut back oil and gas or wherever you are.
And what's loopy about this is that when West Virginia is one of the whitest states, but is also quite poor. I think people understand, whether they agree with him or not, that when Joe Manchin is supportive of the coal and gas industry in West Virginia, that that's because that's what people in West Virginia want.
Yes.
But it doesn't magically change.
No, it doesn't.
When you talk about Black people in Louisiana or Mexican American people in Texas, it's the same. Alaska, Texas, freaking Norway is one of the most progressive countries in the world. And they have this huge state-owned oil and gas company that does all this offshore drilling because it finances their sovereign wealth fund.
Kind of movement, what is interesting, it's driven in this part, the idea is a sort of confrontation with elites in the party. And I would say that the pushback you might get on this is that they're not talking literally about what people literally want living by an oil field, but the harms that have been done by oil and gas and big polluters in corporate America, et cetera, have disproportionately harmed people of color and low-income Americans. And even though the polling in these areas might say they support these economic drivers. What would be best for them is if this other approach that the climate justice groups support were taken, that ultimately it would be better for these communities. So there is a sort of elitist attitude there as well, that they're looking at outcomes, not polling per se.
I mean, though it's worth saying here, I mean, the bill includes billions of dollars in funding for different environmental justice causes.
Oh, the most ever given. And the dispute is whether it's 60 billion or 50 billion or 40 billion. We're talking about billions of dollars for programs to, make cities more green, plant trees and make the air cleaner, et cetera, like billions and millions of dollars.
And this is where, I mean, you and I are two white people here talking. And, I try to be, sensitive to that, attentive, aware. But what I think is a little underrated in this space is the merits of paying attention, not just to polls and surveys of public opinion, but to the behavior of elected officials, right? If the congressman from the Gulf Coast was telling me, like, Matt, like, you've got this all wrong, this Inflation Reduction Act is terrible, I would take that seriously. You know what I mean? If members of Congress representing Chicago or the South Bronx and other places were like, this is bad, this is bad for environmental justice, I think that should give you pause. But that's not like what's actually happening here, right? The climate justice critique is coming from these donor-sponsored nonprofit organizations, which, they can be run by good people, but they're not democratically accountable to the communities that they claim to be speaking for. And in terms of, questions of pragmatism, right, they have no skin in the game, right? I mean, if you are representing St. Louis and there is like money on the table for grant programs to do environmental remediation, it's like really hard to say, well, I'm going to turn that down and like blow up this bill over some pipeline permitting controversy in Southern Virginia. But it's easy, if you're an NGO to like not
right to dig
care.
in and focus in on your issue and looking at something through your own lens and pushing that. And that makes sense.
That's just like my critique of where this has all gone, right? Is, so environmental justice starts with the observation that the environmental movement kind of had its origins in pretty elite white spaces and wasn't necessarily, listening to what more marginalized communities were saying. So that's a good insight to have about yourself. But then the challenge is, well, can you actually listen to what the people in those communities are saying? Or are you going to do what I sort of feel like they've done here, which is create groups that will just tell you what you want to hear? Right. So it's like we can listen to marginalized communities, or we can create a group that is composed of, because there's hundreds of millions of people in the United States of America. You could find like a group of people of any identity who will say anything, if that's what you want, and you're not genuinely listening if the only people who count as environmental justice advocates are ones who are even more extreme on environmental issues, right? Like the actual issue is that people who have, like more concrete material worries in their lives,
right,
just are not.
I don't disagree with your conclusion. I agree with all of that. I think for me, the takeaway when I saw this was how much it has become commonplace for groups who represent a sort of point of view to never take a win. That somehow messaging, we won something and we're going to have a meaningful impact in people's lives on our issue, is somehow not an appropriate position to take. And I don't know that, we know that fear emails and donor emails that say, we're in dire straits, that people open those and donate and et cetera. And I don't want to assign motivations to why groups do this. But as somebody, I have been following Washington politics and policy my whole career. It's something that I think is worth really considering and looking at and trying to understand how we can make people's lives better. That incrementalism isn't a bad thing, that making strides forward seems to be something, to me, that is worth highlighting as good and setting expectations for people who are participating as activists around what can be accomplished if you stick with something, and that this compromise bill has a lot in it that probably would not have been in there, right? If this movement didn't exist, if this movement never came about, would there be would there be tens of billions of dollars in there for climate justice projects? No way, right? It's like it's a victory for this movement. And it's just bizarre to me to not highlight that success and say, we could build on this. Substantively, I just disagree. I suppose that strategically, I think there's nothing wrong with taking credit for where you have accomplished something. And two, it's just such a downer. Like, who wants to get involved? Like people have low faith in government. People don't, overwhelmingly Americans are turned off by the political system. If you want to get people involved in your movement to make change, et cetera, I don't know, maybe be a little more upbeat.
But this is where I do think it matters. I mean, it matters what you define the goal of the movement as, right? And so I think your view of this is, well, this is a measure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to deliver some money for frontline communities to address pollution concerns.
That is my view.
And
yes.
so why won't you take yes for an answer? But I think that there's a set of people, right, whose goal is not to reduce emissions, it's to block fossil fuel projects. And if what you want to do is minimize fossil fuel projects, this bill doesn't do that, right? It reduces emissions on net, but it does mean that permitting will go forward for oil and gas drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, that there probably will be a pipeline built to bring Marcellus shale natural gas into the Northeast. And I think it's confusing to call that ideology climate justice, both because it doesn't have that much to do with climate change and it also doesn't have that much to do with justice. But it's something I sometimes in my writing confuse people by calling it neo-pastoralism. Right.
Yeah, that sounds just yes, I'm sure you do confuse people. But I'm
trying to come up with a better term for it.
I would say this, that the other thing is what you're saying, I think, is that the people at the top, right, the organizers and people who run these organizations have this view, but that's not how they articulate it. Mm-hmm. And it's not how it's articulated to people who probably give money and time and support this cause, who see it as something different. See it as, advancing the interests of people who've been traditionally left out of the environmental movement. And I should say traditionally, I mean that in the sort of longer term, right, the longer term history of the movement. And I mean, that's fine. If you want to go set up a group that just says we stand in the way, we're going to chain ourselves to something and prevent this oil or gas pipeline, et cetera, that's fine. That's fine. That could be your cause. But it seems like there are also people who are interested in these frontline programs because there are groups that are lining up to take these on and have ideas for how to actually implement some of this change.
I think this tension, though, is going to be, with this bill done, right, this ideological tension is going to be very prominent. So you and I both spent a fair amount of time in Maine over the years, right?
It's true.
Nice place. It's beautiful. There's a lot of trees. There's a lot of nice views, ocean, etc. A question that is going to be posed, I think, over and over and over again in Maine. We already had one iteration of this. People wanted to build a high voltage transmission line to take zero carbon hydroelectricity from Quebec into Massachusetts. And they were going to build it through Maine. To do that, you would have to cut down a lot of trees. Mm-hmm. And so this Baptist and Bootleggers coalition of oil companies and conservationists, they blocked that, right? In the town of Blue Hill, where I have spent a lot of time, an ordinance was passed banning the construction of new solar farms.
Right.
Because it's cutting down trees, right? Yeah. And if you think about how like the world works, like you can build offshore wind, but that would kind of spoil the view.
Right.
You can build solar, but that would cut down trees. Maine already has hydro. I don't think there's any rivers left to dam. Environmentalists, I believe they're in the process of getting the nuclear plant there shut down. And, you know, so there's a question of like, are you going to prioritize emissions reductions, or are you going to prioritize the kind of pristine,
right, the conservation movement? And look, Maine has economic interests in preserving. There is cross-cutting things there. There is an extraction economy out of the ocean, et cetera. But a lot of their economy is based on tourism, and they want pristine wilderness and wild Maine. And if you cut down large swaths of forest to build something, yeah, it's their interests are not necessarily, even as people who love the environment and are conservationists, that the larger goals of reduction aren't there.
And I mean I don't want to veer like too far off topic in terms of like what I think Maine should do about this.
I think we should.
But I mean it's just to say it's just to say like I think that it's like confusing to introduce the like climate justice concept like out of left field into this dialogue, because it recurs in different ways in different times and spaces, which is just that like there is a difference between minimize carbon dioxide emissions and maximize like local environmental protection. And people just sort of like they disagree about what matters most to them and what they care about most and who they are. And it recurs in just all kinds of different communities in different kinds of ways. I tend to think that on balance, though, it's probably lower income people who are more inclined to say sort of like, you know, whether it's drill baby drill or build baby build. But, you know, people who are looking for those like hard hat jobs and things like that versus like, you know, retired college professors who just want to chill out and have things look nice. But either way, there's this real tension in the climate space between a reality that like all the physical objects in the world have to change if you want to have zero carbon, and the fact that traditional environmentalism is mostly about kind of keeping things how they are.
Sure.
And I think that's the real disagreement about this bill. That's my bad take.
I don't know if that's what the disagreement's about here. I mean, it's true. What you have identified is a true schism in the environmental movement on the left. And it's been that way a long time. This is sort of like, is environmentalism Teddy Roosevelt or is it something else? Yeah. And it's been going on a long time. But I think that this is a third issue, that separately the injection of social justice and race and economic inequality is something that we are going to see again and again across issues. That the reason I don't think this is simply boiled down to an old dispute is because we can look to other policy areas where we're seeing this emerge that we haven't before. But I don't think your take is bad. And actually, the start of this show.
Yeah.
Should we go back and look at the bad take and come to our conclusion about whether it's bad?
Okay, so we're returning to the original take, which was, after careful study of the language of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, Climate Justice Alliance concludes that the harms of the bill as it is currently written outweigh its benefits. So yeah, I guess we maybe slightly disagreed on what was motivating that take.
Yeah,
but it seems quite bad to me. Like the benefits, unless you're really mad about the tax side of it, I just think like it's clearly good. Like, it's going to make way less pollution. It's going to give money to frontline communities to remediate past harms. It's going to generate a lot of good energy. It's going to facilitate, I think, fossil fuel extraction mostly in places where people want it, and mostly in ways that won't actually increase emissions. So it's good. I like this bill.
You like the bill. I think that it's a bad take, because if you want to get anything done in life, there are other people who are around you, and you're going to have to compromise and negotiate. And I think this was a bill that did that the movement was looking at nothing. If you go back, last year, that the sort of last swing at this died, and that I don't think it's very useful to be a downer about wins.
Absolutely.
So, all right.
So do we have some grid content we think people should check out to learn more about this bill?
Yeah. I think it's useful to know what is actually in the bill, particularly around these credits and buying an electric vehicle. So if you go to Grid, we have a really good piece breaking that down. It's hard to find that information. So I think that's my favorite piece we've done. Check it out.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in this legislation.
Literally what is in the bill.
And the forest for trees aspect of, like, this is bad on balance because of a couple of pipelines, I think will not survive a thorough read of, like, the different kinds of upgrades and benefits that are available to lots of different kinds of households.
I hope this bad take inspires people to understand what's really in the bill, which, that's worthwhile. Anyway, I think this bad take got us to a good place, though.
Fantastic. And we'll be back next week with more takes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right.
All right.
Keep on listening.